Since 2023, the Finals has introduced dozens of weapons, specializations, and gadgets. Some have become fan favorites, others have become controversial, and still more have simply struggled to find a place within the game's ever-changing ecosystem. But whenever discussions happen, the conversation usually falls into one of two camps: buff it or nerf it. And while simple balance changes are certainly important, I've always found myself more interested in a different question. What should this item actually be? This is because good game design isn't merely about power. It's about identity. It's about fantasy. It's about the role an item serves within a larger environment. Sometimes an item can be perfectly balanced and still feel unsatisfying. Other times an item can be incredibly powerful, but in turn create interactions that aren't particularly healthy for the game. So today, we're starting a new series. In these, we'll be taking a deeper look at weapons, gadgets, specializations, and other mechanics in the Finals, and exploring how they could be restructured and redesigned. Not to remove their identity, but to preserve what makes these items unique, while improving how they interact with the system. Each episode will follow the same basic process. First, we'll look at what the item is supposed to accomplish. Then, we'll examine the problems it currently creates. After that, we'll establish a few design goals. Then, we'll use those goals to construct a complete rework. And for the first episode of this series, I wanted to tackle one of the most controversial specializations in the Finals: the Winch Claw. Winch Claw is a specialization for the Heavy class introduced in Season 3 that, according to the official wiki, launches a chain claw that latches onto objects or contestants, pulling them in closer to you. This is its core design philosophy. Winch Claw is an aggressive displacement tool that can manipulate players, objects, objectives, and environmental items' locations. As of now, some of the core stats of Winch goes as follows. It deals 5 damage upon contact. Its max range is 12 meters. Its cooldown is 10 seconds for a miss, 14 seconds for a low value target, and 18 seconds for a high value target. Its stun effect is 0.2 seconds for targets closer than 3 meters and 0.5 seconds for targets further than 3 meters. On paper, Winch is actually a fairly simple specialization. So, what fantasy does this fulfill? What role is the Winch Claw playing? Well, in regards to Embark's default playstyles, the Winch Claw is located in the Enforcer playstyle, focusing on the control of space, pacing, and manipulation of enemy mobility. So I would say that, compared to the other 3 specializations of Heavy, Winch is there for pure aggression. It's designed to rip opponents out of position, reorient the objectives, and force enemies to play more passively. And this is where the Winch can really shine. The Winch Claw is undeniably one of the most versatile items in the game. Not only can it separate enemy teams, grab the cash box, pull in canisters, and grab teammate revive statues, but it can relocate the cash out station and fully interrupt enemy steals and revives. Winch is unquestionably the jack of all trades of the Heavy archetype. And what makes Winch Claw so appealing to so many is how creative its utility can be. Because Winch isn't directly tied to damage, or to healing, or to movement, it has the ability to interact with multiple systems uniquely. And not only this, but its capacity to manipulate both players and objectives allows it to control high-impact moments, such as canceling last-second steals or strategically repositioning a cash-out station. or even simply shifting the odds of a fight. These create memorable moments. Regardless of where we end up later in this video, I want to emphasize that these are the aspects of Winch that I believe should be preserved. The ability to manipulate players, objectives, and environmental objects is what makes Winch unique. It's creative, it's flexible, and it creates memorable moments that few other specializations can replicate. The challenge with Winch Claw is that many of its greatest strengths are also responsible for many of its biggest design problems. Its versatility allows it to interact with nearly every system in the game. Its displacement ability gives it tremendous influence over positioning, and its ability to manipulate both players and objectives creates some of the most satisfying moments in the finals. But when a single specialization possesses this much influence, it becomes important to ask whether it is achieving those goals in a healthy way. To understand why Winch has remained one of the most controversial specializations since its release, we need to look beyond its base power and instead examine how it actually creates its value. First and foremost, one major component of the Winch is the fact that it is not a held item. Some specializations, like the Goo Gun, require the user to swap to that item before it can be used. Winch Claw, on the other hand, can be activated regardless of what is currently being held. This means instant accessibility. There is no preparation, no anticipation, and no visible commitment. The result is that Winch bypasses many of the interaction rules that governs the rest of the finals. Now, this lack of predictability is not an inherent problem with all instantly accessible specializations. Charge and Slam is another insta-use specialization, but it has a much shorter effective range, has a clear movement path, requires significant commitment after activation, and is directly designed to have a last resort activation capacity. Winch lacks many of those limitations. Another aspect of Winch Claw that probably draws the most frustration is its ability to auto-cancel existing actions and commitments, including but not limited to melee swings, aggressive specializations like Charge and Slam, revives, and cash-out steals. The problem here is that Winch does not just cause a stun that prevents future actions from taking place. It actively erases actions that have already been committed to. This distinction is critical. Remember, weapon categories and actions do not experience this interaction equally. Guns, for example, fire almost instantly and lose relatively little upon being cancelled out of pre-existing actions. Melee, though, necessitates long windups and high commitment, meaning they lose disproportionately more when being winched out of an action. A third component of Winch Claw is part of what we were praising earlier: its versatility. A specialization being a sort of jack of all trades is not automatically a problem. However, the Winch might be too much of a jack of all trades. Remember, Winch Claw does a lot. It displaces players, it displaces objectives, it displaces revive statues, it displaces canisters, it displaces map props, it interrupts steals, it interrupts revives. It also features emergent gameplay, where players use Winch to open fights to get free hits off or to parry long-winded attacks. The issue is not that Winch performs any of these functions. The issue is that it performs all of them, often encroaching on design space traditionally occupied by other specialized tools. Let's take the Nullifier as an example. The primary use case of Nullifier is the ability to instantly cancel important enemy actions such as steals and revives. The question then becomes, if the Nullifier exists as a specialized interruption tool, why would Winch also perform that exact same function while simultaneously excelling in several others unrelated to it? A fourth aspect of Winch Claw is that it has very limited reactive counterplay. We already discussed earlier that Winch Claw lacks predictability, given that it can be triggered without any visual commitment. However, on top of this, once you are officially hit by the Winch, the result is largely decided. You are stunned, pulled in, and then dealt mass amounts of damage with very few options to fight back. The window for meaningful response is extremely small. And lastly, the hitbox of Winch Claw is unreasonably forgiving. The fact that you can use Winch, miss your target on the way out, and then still hit them on the way back is unnecessary and unwarranted. Successful hooks should be rewarded. Missed hooks should remain misses. It's as simple as that. These issues become particularly noticeable when heavy melee enters the discussion. One of the primary challenges of melee weapons is their need to close distance and commit to attacks. Winch bypasses much of that challenge by bringing targets directly into range while at the same time interrupting their ability to respond. As a result, many players have argued that properly balancing heavy melee is nigh impossible while Winch remains in its current state. Fundamentally, none of these issues are individually game-breaking. The problem is that they all exist on the same specialization simultaneously. Winch Claw has low commitment, can cancel pre-existing actions, has unjustified versatility, has very limited reactive counterplay, and has an extremely forgiving hitbox. The result is a specialization that has remained meta since its very inception. If we're going to redesign the Winch, we first need to establish a few principles. Because the goal here isn't to simply nerf the specialization. Winch is popular for a reason. It's fun, it's flexible, and it encourages creativity. A redesign that removes those qualities would be missing the point. So, Principle 1. Preserve identity. The goal here is to protect what Winch does best. The Winch Claw must remain aggressive. It should still be able to initiate fights. It should still force engagements. Winch should also remain a displacement tool. Pulling players is the leading part of the design after all. And thirdly, Winch must retain its utility. It should still be able to interact with the objective and the surrounding environment. None of these abilities should be on the chopping block. Principle 2. Influence should require commitment. The more influence an ability has over the sandbox, the more commitment should generally be required to use it. Specializations like Dematerializer can majorly affect components of the environment, so it requires the user to commit to it in order to be used. Winch, due to its ability to completely negate player mobility, should have some way to be anticipated and read. This allows for some margin of decision-making from opponents, which again facilitates commitment on the Winch user's part. Principle 3. Existing commitments should matter. Actions have value. A player going for a secondary melee swing, or a heavy triggering a charge, or a player committing to a revive are all actions that should retain meaning. Disruption is healthy. Erasure is more questionable. A displacement tool should disrupt actions, but it should not retroactively invalidate actions that have already been earned. Principle 4. Strength is fine. Roll compression is not. The problem here is not that Winch is strong. Rather, it is when one specialization begins performing too many unrelated jobs simultaneously. Roles should have clear-cut boundaries, even ones with emergent gameplay. Players should generally have a reasonable understanding of what a single specialization or gadget is capable of accomplishing. This allows for sandbox diversity with many different varying abilities that can be stacked through synergistic loadouts, rather than complete reliance on a singular, one-size-fits-all utility item. And Principle 5. Precision should be rewarded. Strong abilities ought to reward proper execution, but misses should remain as misses. Overly generous mechanics can exist in certain scenarios. However, generally speaking, the more straightforward or more powerful an ability is, the less wiggle room should be given in return. This is standard risk-reward balancing. So, if we want to preserve Winch's aggression, displacement, and utility, while increasing commitment, respecting existing actions, reducing roll compression, and rewarding precision. What would that redesign actually look like? Before discussing the redesign itself, I think it is important to recognize something very interesting about the current state of the winch. Despite being designed as a displacement tool, many of its strongest and most common use cases have very little to do with displacement. In direct combat, winch is often used at point-blank range as a free opener, where the movement itself is almost irrelevant. During objective defense, it's frequently valued as a revive and steal canceling tool. In both cases, the specialization derives much of its value from interruption rather than repositioning. Ideally, a rework should move Winch Claw back toward its intended identity as a displacement tool without sacrificing the aggression and utility that make it appealing in the first place. That being said, the first thing I do is incorporate an idea pitched by this Reddit user, who argued that winch should be an item that must be actively held in order to be used, similar to the goo gun. Others have suggested simply adding a startup delay to the specialization, but I think making winch a held item is a much cleaner solution, because it addresses several of the underlying problems at the same time. For starters, it preserves the immediacy of winch. Users can still activate it the moment they decide to commit, but now that commitment must be made in advance by swapping to it. The biggest danger to the health of Winch Claw is how low risk and high reward it can be. By requiring users to swap to it before use, it raises its commitment level. Just as importantly, this change also enables anticipation and readability. This creates a healthier combat loop by giving opponents a chance to recognize and react to a potential winch attack, rather than being forced to respond only after the hook has already landed. One small bonus to having the winch being held is that it can now possess fun and unique skins like other items in the game. The next thing I would change is in regards to the stun. The stun will now no longer auto-cancel existing actions. Actions that have already been committed to before the Winch Claw will remain in effect. However, any future actions will be prevented as usual. This means that actions like melee swings and charge and slam will continue even after being hit by the winch. Drawing back from earlier, this is done to ensure that existing commitments do matter. This allows for players to predict an incoming winch and to pre-fire a melee swing. This will also bring winch's interaction with melee back in line with where it arguably should be. The official wiki notes that pulling in a melee user can lead to an unfavorable fight. In practice, however, winch is often at its strongest against melee because the winch user can fire through most of an incoming swing before cancelling it outright. Under this redesign, that committed attack would continue, making melee users far less vulnerable to having their actions erased at the last possible moment. This same sentiment would apply to other short-ranged attacks, like charge and slam. Winch users should have to think carefully about who they want to winch into their vicinity, rather than being free to do so to anyone with no fear of punishment. It is also worth noting here that, with these changes to the stun effect, iterations on the stun duration of the winch could be performed, especially if the time it takes to swap from winch back to one's primary proves to be too long to be effective. Thirdly, I would change the hitbox of the Winch Claw to only exist on outbound travel. In other words, the winch can only grab objects and contestants as the winch travels outwards. If you miss, you miss. You are no longer given a second chance to hit players on its way back. This change directly addresses one of the most forgiving aspects of the specialization. Precision ought to be rewarded, plain and simple. One consequence of the previous change is that winch would no longer instantly cancel steals and revives simply by touching the target. At first glance, this might sound like a major nerf. However, I would argue that it actually pushes winch closer to its intended identity. The idea that Winch can just auto-cancel steals and revives doesn't fit with Winch Claw's design. For example, imagine if Trojan Slam inflicted fire damage upon contact. That wouldn't make it overpowered necessarily, but it would make you question why it was there. I think Winch Claw canceling steals and revives falls into a similar category. Not because it is overpowered, but because it bypasses the actual mechanism that Winch is supposed to use. Winch was always supposed to be able to stop steals. It just had to do so by separating the stealer and the cash-out station. This facilitates far more creativity and skill expression with Winch Claw usage, forcing the user to play smart and within the Winch's known limitations. This is significantly better than giving Winch access to the same interruption utility as Nullifier in conjunction with all of the other things it can do. The same goes for enemy revives. And to support this one, I would also modify the Winch Claw to be able to grab enemy revive statues. Now, this does not mean that you can pick them up afterwards, but you would be able to displace enemy statues with the Winch. Winch Claw should be able to cancel steals and revives because it relocated the player, not because it merely touched the player. Taken together, these changes are not designed to remove Winch Claw's power or utility. Winch would still be encouraged to initiate fights, manipulate objectives, separate teams, and reposition environmental objects in unique ways. Winch would still create all of the memorable moments that made the specialization so popular in the first place. What changes is how that power is expressed and utilized. In short, the goal of this redesign is not to make Winch weaker. The goal is to make it healthier, to preserve everything that makes the specialization unique, while ensuring that its strengths come from the things it was originally designed to do. So, that's how I would redesign the Winch Claw. This rework attempts to preserve everything that makes Winch unique, while shifting its power back toward its intended identity. Winch would still be a creative, high-impact item. The difference is that it would now accomplish those things through commitment, positioning, and displacement, rather than through automatic interruption and low-risk engagement tools. Whether you agree with these specific changes or not, I think the broader lesson is that balance is only one part of game design. An item can be strong, weak, balanced, overpowered, but the more important question is often whether it is accomplishing the role it was actually designed to fulfill. But that's just my take on the Winch. Let me know what you think of these changes, what you would do differently, and most importantly, what weapon, gadget, or specialization you'd like to see covered next in this series.